So I just want to shout out Spadina Road Library, which is my local branch. That's where I'm coming to you from today. And I looked in the chat and we have people from all over the continent, maybe even farther than that. Some of them don't even have Toronto Public Library branches. So that's very cool. And I guess representative of pirates and how widespread piracy was and how people came from all kinds of different places. I just want to show you the books that I read in preparation for this panel and all the fascinating details that I uncovered. I did not know very much about pirates before this. I was not the hugest pirate enthusiast, but now I'm very interested and I'm glad we have a panel of experts on hand. Oh, I just see we have someone from Argentina. Like this is amazing. So I enjoyed these books so much. And if you are local, yeah, order them from the wonderful people at Queen Books. Um, I want to start with a quote from Catherine's book. So Catherine's book is fiction, and Rebecca's book is nonfiction with like a popular edge. And then Brittany's book is academic. And I am so thrilled by all of these different ways of approaching the pirate narrative being braided together. I think that's going to be so interesting and we'll have a lot to learn from each other. But I feel like you might all have one thing in common. And it was a quote from Catherine's author's note in her novel. She begins it by writing, "I can't stop thinking about pirates." So I want to know, where did the passion begin for you? And I guess could we start with you, Catherine? Because you said it.
Sure. First of all, I want to say what a delight it is to be joining you all today. And I have a special connection to Toronto because I went sledding for the first time in my life in Toronto when I was in my 20s, because I'm originally from Texas, where we do not go sledding. And so whenever I think of Toronto, I think of sledding in a garbage bag, very cold, when I was 23 years old.
I love that.
So I started thinking about pirates. I actually don't know when I started thinking about pirates, but my only hobby is that I'm a sailor. And there are not a whole lot of women in the sailing world. I mean, there's more, there's been a push for it. And as a result, like most sailors, I think a lot about times from the golden age of sail. And some of the greatest stories of that are stories of piracy. And there is kind of a recurring fictional trope of women disguised as men and going pirating. And so, as someone who writes historical fiction, and especially historical fiction that focuses on the early modern period, most of my books up until this point have been about witches and witchcraft. And it was striking to me when I noticed that the period of the golden age of piracy exactly maps onto the last stage of the witch craze. And in witch trials, you have people who have somehow represented a challenge to the status quo, being punished in a spectacular fashion and public fashion, but most of those people are women. And in piracy, you have people from regular working backgrounds who challenge the status quo and are punished in a very spectacular and public way. And most of those people are men. And so I was thinking a lot about how witches and pirates are two instances where regular people leave more of a record of themselves in the archive than we might otherwise expect. And so all of those reasons kind of came together for me in a desire to write a really well-researched, well-grounded historical fiction work about a woman who disguises herself as a man and goes pirating.
That's wonderful. Um, Rebecca, how did you begin your passion for pirates?
My passion for pirates, I think, came in a few different ways. For one, I'm from the LA area and always loved going to the beach. Growing up, my grandparents live at the beach, and my mom would take us to Disneyland every year. My favorite ride was always Pirates of the Caribbean, just because I love water rides. I thought it was so cool. And then I was in high school. I just graduated high school when the first Pirates of the Caribbean film came out, and I thought it was one of the greatest films I'd ever seen. Absolutely loved it. But but other than that, I didn't think much beyond Pirates, beyond the ride and Treasure Island and everything like that, and the Johnny Depp movie. And then when I was doing my master's degree, I began studying Atlantic history because my two big passions for history was colonial America and early modern British history. And I was like, how do I combine this into one? And then a professor started an Atlantic history program. So it was perfect. And one of the books we read was Villains of All Nations by Marcus Rediker. And this is kind of about like the dialectic of terror between like British officials and pirates and kind of society of pirates on ships and what the realities were. And I was like, how did we get from that to Jack Sparrow? And I love historical fiction. I love historical film. And I love marrying real history with fiction. And so I really wanted to kind of explore how history and pop culture intersect. And so this was a great way for me to do it. And I found this subject of pirates really, really interesting. I knew I wanted to do public history and I wanted to do something that I knew would interest people. So luckily I found this subject that I found so fascinating, pirates, and I was able to kind of look at it in terms of pop culture. And so I kind of analyzed how the novel Treasure Island changed our perceptions of pirates. And then for my PhD, I wanted to expand on it, on perceptions of piracy. And when I started my doctorate at King's College London in 2012, I read that the pirate Captain Kidd was executed at Execution Dock on the Thames in East London. And I thought that was interesting because I knew that people were generally publicly executed for crimes at the Tyburn Tree in West London. So I was like, oh, I'm going to read a book or an article about why pirates were publicly executed elsewhere. No one had written about it. And so that became my PhD topic, and began researching public executions and pirates and perceptions of pirates. And so I've been doing this for like, gosh, so for years and years. And I joke, my favorite thing to do, what I really do, is I ruin what we love about pirates. So it's been great.
But it all began with a trip to the beach.
It all began with a trip to the beach.
That's fantastic.
Yep. Thank you, grandparents, for moving to the beach.
Brittany, do you have an attachment to Treasure Island? Because I know that Treasure Island is woven into Catherine's book, and Rebecca has mentioned it. Was that something that was important to you?
To be honest, I didn't really have any piracy connection or interest prior to being thrown into it, I should say, during my graduate studies. I was a PhD student at Toronto, and I was actually working in East Africa with UN Habitat on crime in Africa. And we found out, I think about 2 months after I was there, that our program was getting defunded. So I had been just socializing with a group of gentlemen after work regularly, and they said, hey, we need someone in our office to help write grants and help us do some research. Could you do that? And I said, sure. So I showed up on Monday, and I was working with the counter-piracy office. And the next thing I know, 6 months later, I was interviewing pirates in Somalia and down in the Seychelles, and really kind of in the midst of pirates. And that's been my life for the last 15 years now, is pirates. So it just came out of the blue on a Friday afternoon and a Monday morning.
As pirates do.
Yes.
So Brittany, to my mind, you brought me to my next question to you specifically. I'd always, not being much of a pirate person, I guess, had thought there was a disconnect between the pirates of Robert Louis Stevenson and modern day piracy, sort of the same way that I always knew that guy downloading music off the internet is not Long John Silver. But your book makes a through line between the golden age of piracy, so-called golden age, and modern day piracy off the coast of Somalia. So that your book kind of suggests that I had it wrong. What do you think? And can you talk about what that through line is?
Right. So again, I was working on contemporary, piracy happening about, starting in 2009 onward in East Africa, and then most recently a little bit in West Africa. But it wasn't until I started writing my dissertation and really realizing and looking at, all these wonderful historical scholars who have written about, piracy back in the 1800s, that there's actually a lot of similarity and continuity between those ages, and specifically with women. Interestingly, piracy started, when we're thinking about, privateering, and it was government sanctioned and this and that. And then it was all of a sudden, once a certain group the government didn't want involved was doing it, then all of a sudden they're pirates and outlaws and, enemy of mankind. Well, there's a lot of similarity when you look at Somalia in particular. The government also was involved to an extent in that and had helped get that going. And then once it became too big, then, all of a sudden the pirates are bad people, and, they want to take care of the problem, so to speak. But also, even if you look down at the very, micro level of that, the land-based operations of piracy are what I would argue kind of the most important aspect of piracy, because it takes place over a really long period of planning. You need those support systems to move the goods that you get. You need people to help fuel. You need people to help, support the financial front end of that. So, without that, there wouldn't be the actual operations at sea. And that's why we look at piracy today. And the problem we have in combating the piracy out at sea is that nobody's actually paying attention to what's happening on shore.
So do you think that it's similar to what Rebecca was saying about piracy and witches being a way of understanding ordinary people, these extraordinary stories actually illuminating ordinary, the kind of quotidian, boring lives of the people in a place? Is it the same, do you think, with piracy in Somalia?
I do. I think one of the things, and I remember this one of the first times that I went to Somalia with a group from my office, we kind of sat there that first night at our little bunker, in the middle of nowhere. And, you just look around and it's just everybody trying to survive and go about their business. And we all kind of sat there and laughed to each other. And we're like, I think we would have been pirates. Like, if this is what we had, if these were our options, like, I completely understand why people will just, take this big risk to at least try to set themselves and their families up for generations in the context of Somalia. To us, it seemed like a rather reasonable thing to do.
And that shows up in all your books, the fact that this is like for people with limited means, this is social mobility. It's a way to access it. My next question for all of you, and maybe we'll start with Rebecca, is what does the perception of pirates in Western culture today, Western culture's perception of pirates, pirates in general and women pirates specifically, what's wrong about it? What do you want to correct with your scholarship and your writing?
Well, I think for me, a lot of the things that I try to do are correct the misconceptions of piracy. And, I won't lie, these misconceptions are really fun. The buried treasure, X marks the spot, the eye patch, the peg leg. Like, there's always like little kernels of truth into that because the info had to come from somewhere. But I think kind of a big thing is just like the general romanticization of piracy, I think sometimes gets carried a bit further than they deserve, really. And so that's something I always try to kind of point out, because I'm not trying to demonize piracy at all whatsoever, because I do believe they were extremely important figures in the development of colonial America and the Caribbean and everything like that. But what I always try to discuss, and what I always try to remind people, is that pirates were, for the most part, regular people with families who were doing this to make some money, get out of poverty, send money home to their families. And this is something really important to remember, that not everyone had like these adventurous ambitions. Not everybody had these criminal ambitions. The vast majority was doing it for economic reasons. And I also like to point out that, piracy was actually much more organized than we really believe it was. It wasn't just like kind of this chaos and death and everything like that. Actually, very few pirates were that violent. They were very much the exception to the rule. But I think kind of in terms of how what Western culture might get wrong about female pirates, I don't necessarily want to say that they get things wrong about female pirates, because we have so little information about female pirates. And I think there's a lot we love to speculate about, and there's a lot we love to really guess and think about. And I think there is kind of this idea that, if a woman was going to be a pirate, she'd disguise herself as a man. And I think that could be true to some extent, or at the very least, women would wear men's clothing. I think that there were a lot more women than we probably think, that we know of. And so this is something I try to talk about. But as a historian, as we all know, as a historian, if the information isn't there in a document, it's very difficult to actually say it definitively. So it leads for really great discussion. So sorry if I got long-winded, but
no, that's good. Catherine, how about you? In your book, what perceptions are you trying to correct or put out in the world?
One thing that was really surprising to me so in the course of researching a true account, Hannah Masuri Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself, I spent a lot of time in primary sources and ended up releasing those as an edited volume as the Penguin Book of Pirates. And one of the things that was really surprising to me, and it shouldn't have been surprising to me, but it was the degree to which piracy during the Golden Age which we, as Rebecca says, we romanticize it because it represented this will to freedom. And it was a will to freedom in a moment when most people had practically no freedom or choice whatsoever. You know, it was a time of impressment. It was a time of like vast economic disparity and things like that. One of the things that really surprised me was to really see it spelled out the extent to which this drive for radical freedom collided with and was completely dependent upon the transatlantic trade in enslaved people. In a way, it like at my most cynical, it makes me think that we romanticize pirates as a way of talking about maritime life without having to talk about enslavement.
Oh, wow.
Because, you know, there are instances of crews on ships that were designed to transport enslaved people mutinying and becoming pirate ships. There are instances of self-liberating people liberating themselves and joining pirate crews. There are instances of ships with a cargo of enslaved people being captured by pirates. And one thing I tried to do was actually spend some time with the slave voyage database and figure out what happened to people when they were captured by a pirate ship. And there's actually very little clarity about how often that happened. Like there are in some instances where it almost makes me wonder, and if I were a better historian, I would know a way to figure this out. It makes me wonder if there was some kind of like paperwork way of erasing the intersection of piracy with enslavement, because it makes me wonder if insurance companies insured voyages differently or at different rates, because it's the only way to explain how few instances there are of that particular contact point. But for me, that was the biggest surprise, figuring out that there was this, like, that you cannot talk about piracy and not talk about the history of enslavement.
And Brittany, we've had a lot here, but do you have anything to add to that from your work specifically?
I think what I found interesting at the beginning of just my work and research was that piracy was romanticized also in contemporary Somali piracy for the first few years. You know, you'd have a handful of pirates that would come in with, you know, these large, you know, $1 million ransoms and buying cars and houses and all these other illicit things, right? And people were very envious of this. We had young women in Somalia wanting to run away from their families and marry pirates so that they could have a better life and move to Europe. We had young boys that were trying to go and join piracy so that they could have these things as well. I mean, because these things aren't seen right on a regular day in Somalia. So for the first couple years, it was a large part of what the UN was doing, was trying to combat this kind of romanticization. And it wasn't until they started to see the rise in prices for regular goods because of
Oh,
piracy's
yeah.
influx that then the people started saying, hey, wait, you know, all of a sudden now all the store shops are charging more money for these things because pirates are paying more money for them. And I think also what surprised me, besides women's large involvements on shore in the piracy operations, was also that the pirates themselves, when you would interview and speak with them, and even some of the community members to an extent, would always kind of couch the piracy situation within these broader geopolitical and geoeconomic inequalities. So the idea that they were very aware that a lot of the ships that were getting hijacked were, or they were very aware, or they would kind of frame it as, well, we're just taking back what they took from us. So it was kind of this feeling that, you know, the international community has taken so much from Somalia that this is their chance to take back what's kind of theirs. You know, their fish were being taken from illegal fishermen from Europe and Asia. They had toxic dumping off the shore of Somalia that was kind of poisoning the coastal communities, children. And so it was kind of this, you know, this is our way of kind of getting even with what's been done to us. And I think that was really surprising because, yes, obviously a lot of it was for personal greed or advancement or setting their families up. But there was also kind of this, you know, making wrongs right. And I found that quite surprising.
Thank you. You touched on this a bit, Catherine, but each of your books do, before we talk about women in piracy specifically, I want to talk about the way that each of your books undermines the idea of piracy's whiteness and Eurocentricness. Can you talk about the roles of race in piracy and our perceptions of it? And I guess, Catherine, I want to know a little bit more about Seneca in your book, or have you tell us, and Rebecca, if you could talk about some of the historical characters in your book before you talk about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. You touch on a few other pirates as well. And maybe we'll start with you, Brittany, and just talk about the role of race in the perception of piracy and Somali piracy.
Sure. I think, I mean, because the piracy that's kind of been most active in the last, I'd say 10, 15 years has been mostly off of East Africa, West Africa, and then Southeast Asia. So within that, demographic, it's not white. None of the pirates are white, right? So for me personally, when I think of pirates, the white pirates is not the first thing I think of, just because every pirate I've met or researched has not been. But it was interesting because even, within the broader counter piracy community, whenever people would kind of like very lightheartedly talk about pirates, they would still kind of reference the white European pirates. And instead of talking about, well, no, most pirates of today are actually kind of located in, Africa and East Asia. But it was interesting to me because I don't feel like the internet, and perhaps it's not far enough along in history, I don't get a sense that these, non-European pirates will ever be glamorized or romanticized in the same way that we have with pirates of the past. I'm yet to see any pirate costumes. We were talking, about Halloween costumes and the pirates, right? No one's trying to replicate any of these type of pirates anytime soon. But I think even when, you Google just pirates now today, if it comes up and you do happen to see contemporary piracy, it's always kind of this very, racialized Somali man with an AK-47, right, standing on a cliff overlooking the sea. So it's very like violent looking instead of, just kind of what we had talked about. Most pirates haven't been. So I don't know. I think it might be too early to kind of do a comparison of how we look at this kind of the visual and the racial of the pirates in comparison. But from what I've seen, I've always tend to see them depicted as much more kind of violent in images than some of the pirates of the past.
Rebecca, can you talk about some other pirates from, I think China was one of, anyway, yes.
So in terms of race and piracy, this is a really interesting subject, and it's something I've been like kind of starting to work on a little bit. In terms of the golden age of piracy, most of what I found in terms of kind of diversity on pirates, I wrote about in my book Pirates Code, and there has been kind of like this long debate or discussion about what role diversity played on the pirate ship, particularly with African pirates or formerly enslaved or freed enslaved, escaped enslaved people, and the role they played. Some people have believed that pirates were like these, altruistic people who welcomed the marginalized folk onto a ship. And then other people argued, actually, no, if they were on the ship, they got the most menial jobs. Pirates did take enslaved people as part of cargo. It's listed in trial transcripts when they would often list the goods that pirates had stolen. In terms of stealing major pirate ships, so far in my research, I'm only still early in it, so far in my research, it was very rare for a pirate to be able to take a very large slave ship just because of resources. Blackbeard was known to have taken a slave ship, and he reportedly took a lot of enslaved people into his crew, and so a lot of people think Blackbeard was a savior. He did have a confidant, possibly, who may have been an African slave, but he also did sell most of them later at a slave market. So it's a very, very complicated idea about race on pirate ships. Now, one thing in terms about that, though, is that lots also, and to get your point about the Chinese female pirate in just a sec, a lot of people do think that Pirates of the Caribbean, from the Golden Age, tended to mostly be white. And this is far from the truth because it just was such a diverse region of the world. And so we do actually have pirates of a lot of different races or origins, backgrounds. I think the first Pirates of the Caribbean films show that very well. The show Black Sails depicts that very well also. But I think there are also some pirates that need to be acknowledged. So in the 19th century, one of the most infamous pirates was Cheng Yi Sao, who was a female pirate, and in the South China Seas, who co-ruled with her husband, and they managed a fleet of hundreds of ships, over 1,000 pirates. She allowed women to be pirates on the ship, and there were very strict rules about treating them well, or else you could be killed if you mistreated them. And she was so powerful that the government couldn't stop her. They had to basically pay her to retire. And the story goes, she eventually did, and kind of opened up a series of brothels for and operated those for the rest of her life. But she was a pirate for a pretty short amount of time, maybe just about a decade or so. I forget the exact years, but she managed to create such kind of like an infamous tale for herself, which is very unusual for female pirates kind of throughout history. But she was also in a position of power, which
Mhm.
I think was quite unique as well. And this is how she was able to become very well known and also very powerful by being married to a man who was a very powerful pirate commander. And after she was widowed, she was able to take over. And because she already had that respect from the crew. So it's a very, very interesting story. And these are the type of stories that need to be told a lot more. And I think, as historians continue to research it, because more and more people are going into this area of researching in piracy, I think we're going to start uncovering a lot more really interesting information that we haven't seen.
10 years though, isn't that a long time to be a pirate? Like,
Well, I don't know if those are the exact years. It is
yeah,
true as a general pirate, like if you were just a member of the crew, oftentimes your life expectancy during the golden age of piracy was about 2 years before death or
yeah.
capture, et cetera, et cetera. But there were also these exceptional cases, and I do believe that the context of piracy in southeastern China was quite different. And I don't know enough to be able to
Yeah.
speak about those differences, but I think it was just because of the power that they had, the amount of fleets that they had. The Chinese Navy just couldn't take them out, basically. But again, that's kind of the extent to my knowledge. I wish I knew more someday.
Catherine, can you talk about the character of Seneca and why he was important to include in Hannah Massery's story?
So I first started thinking about diversity in pirate crews. I actually have an unpublished pirate novel. This is how long I've been thinking about pirates. It is rightfully in the drawer. But many years ago, I was working, because I'm originally from Texas, I grew up with stories about Jean Lafitte. And so I was working on a pirate novel about Jean Lafitte because I discovered that in Jean Lafitte's sort of pirate encampment on Galveston Island, which was at the very beginning of the 19th century, that there was a woman in that camp. And I was like, wow, I need to tell that story. So in the course of researching Jean Lafitte, I discovered that he had one of his most important people in his retinue was the man who served as his supercargo, which is to say the guy who did the negotiating with people on shore. His supercargo to the Karankawa nation was a guy who was actually a Portuguese Jewish guy. And that was fascinating to me to think about, that like the person whose job it was to communicate with the Karankawa nation, which was the indigenous people living on the coast of Texas where Lafitte set up camp, that his job, that job would fall to someone with that kind of background. And that got me thinking about, the fact that for a lot of people in the maritime world, they felt more of an affinity with the world of the ocean than with the world of their origin. And so, like, an example of that would be an early 17th century pirate named Jack Ward, who was English nominally, but who became a most notorious pirate of the Barbary Coast. He actually converted to Islam, went by the name Shakur, and took a second wife who was, I believe, Venetian. And he was such a problem to England and to English shipping in the Mediterranean that the different sort of nation states were trying to bribe him into stopping his depredations along the Mediterranean coast. So there is this, to my mind, very interesting, slippery kind of extra-national identity that forms for someone who's been in the ocean for a long time or living their life in the ocean for a long time. And so I knew when trying to write my fictional account for a true account. So Hannah Massury is the fictional person. She's a teenage girl of all work who starts out in Boston, and she's present at William Fly's hanging. This is a real thing that happened in Boston in summer of 1726. A guy who led a mutiny on a merchant ship because of hard usage, ended up being very quickly captured and publicly tried and publicly executed. And then his body was gibbeted on Nix's Mate, which is one of the Boston Harbor Islands. And that means that his body was left to rot in chains as a warning to all the mariners coming and going in and out of Boston Harbor around that time. And I tried to imagine, so one of the things that makes William Fly interesting to me to think about is that he refused to apologize. He was made to stand up in front of everyone in Boston. The guys he was on trial with and he was about to die with were all blubbering and apologizing and ruining the day that they'd ever gone astray. And his final words, first, when he mounted the scaffold, he looked at the noose and then looked at the hangman and said, "Don't you know your trade?" And he untied the noose and retied it. which is because he's a sailor. Sailors have to know their knots, which I thought was amazing. And then his final words from the scaffold were something like, "Masters of vessels, do it well by your men, lest they be put upon doing as I have done." And then I thought, how would it feel if you were a marginal, working, orphaned teenage girl watching this happen? You know, what would that kind of awaken in you, in your imagination? And so when I was trying to imagine the fictional fleet of pirates that Hannah ends up joining, there are a couple of guys who are taken from the historical record who are there. One is Ned Lowe, who is one of the most notorious pirates of that time and who did spend some time in Boston. So I do play a little bit fast and loose with dates, but Ned Lowe did spend time in Boston, and so Hannah ends up with Ned Lowe. And Ned Lowe's kind of second in command, according to the primary sources, was a guy named Charles Harris. And I thought it would be pretty interesting if Charles Harris were a self-liberating person of color. And so I have him take a different name for himself because he doesn't want to use the name that he was born with. And I knew that it would be important to have many different kinds of people. So I actually have a character who is kind of inspired a bit by some of the reading I did about Gulf Coast piracy. Is a guy who's from Spanish Florida, but who's actually speaks Creole French from Louisiana because he was smuggling in the Balize when he was young, and that's his background. And so I thought it would be important to have a range of ages, a range of ethnicities, a range of languages in which the most common factor was their allegiance to the life of the sea.
In your book, you also have a second storyline that we haven't touched upon. There's a character called Marian. She's a Radcliffe professor in the 1930s. She's become a bit cynical and jaded. And I underlined some of your prose is so good. And I underlined Marian was no stranger to the seduction of thinking you had found exactly what you were dreaming of finding in the archive. She had had her heart broken more than once in more than one special collection. Is there something, and this is for you, Catherine, is there something in particular about this to women in piracy? And why is it such a challenge? Are the gaps in the archive bigger than in other archives?
Well, the trick is that when you're writing about regular people, many of these people aren't lettered, right? And so it's not like you're going to come across there are some instances of people who've kept journals or written first-person accounts of their life as a pirate, and there are a couple of those examples in the Penguin Book of Pirates. But for the most part, any picture that you're going to get of a pirate is going to come from someone in a position of power over them. So like William Fly's account, the dialogue that I have him, that happens on the scaffold, I actually take from Cotton Mather's account of it. Cotton Mather oversaw the trial of William Fly and his execution. He was the same guy who oversaw the Salem witch trials, which is why you can see why I would see there was a parallel between those two phenomena. So oftentimes you're going to get a picture of pirates from people in a position to judge them. So someone who, like a mariner who's been attacked by pirates, for example, or a judge who's sitting in judgment on pirates, or a theologian who's trying to write against piracy and against the chaos and anarchy that they see piracy representing. It's unusual to get someone who is inside it and to get their own perspective on it. And especially when you're talking about women. So this is something that I kind of play with narratively in A True Account. I've noticed now that I'm a mid-career novelist, which is appalling to think about, but is the truth. And I've discovered that I have certain narrative habits of mind. And one of them is, especially when writing about the early modern period, I like to have a storyline that is closer to the present that can interpret what's going on in the past, which is why I write a lot about academics or grad students or like people who are wanting to learn about something. So I've noticed that I have this habit of mind. So Marian comes about partly because of that. Partly, though, also Marian she's living in 1929, 1930. She's living kind of a constrained life of her own. And so part of what is happening in the story of A True Account is Marian discovering this character. The central organizing question of the novel is the true account true? Is it the truth? Which is an open question when dealing with a lot of primary sources about pirates. Like the primary source that gives us most of our stories of Golden Age piracy is called A General History of the Pirates. And there's a lot that could be said about that book. not least of which is for many years it's been subject to some debate, although I think it's largely settled, who the author was. No one entirely knew who had written this account. And in subsequent editions of that book, the stories contained therein become kind of juicier, more fanciful because it's a bestseller. And that's where we get the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. It's where we learn about Blackbeard. It's where we get a lot of images of these people, including Blackbeard. Like there's a woodcut of Blackbeard with his, like his matches stuck under his hat, looking terrifying. So there's a visual culture element to it as well. And so I wanted Marion to be there both because the story shows how Marion's research into piracy changes herself and her character, but it is also a way to give voice to these kinds of questions that the archive is constantly posing.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing that I thought was fun narratively to think about is it's true that on ships in this time period, they all had boys on board. Whether they were a merchant ship, or they were a naval ship, or they were a pirate ship, they had boys on board. And it occurred to me that a girl like Hannah, who is malnourished, who wouldn't have a lot of body fat, who had worked hard her entire life, that the way her body would read, she might not even have begun to menstruate yet, even if she was in her late teens, if she didn't have enough body fat to make that possible. So someone whose body looks like this, put in the right clothing, could be taken as an adolescent boy, I think, pretty easily. And so there's one moment when towards the end, Marion is going through, there's a museum in Salem, not far from where I live, called the Peabody Essex Museum, which has evolved many times over the years, but was originally founded by a group of ship captains from Salem who brought interesting curios back from their voyages overseas. And for many years, there was a gallery that just had paintings of mariners, ship captains, but also younger people. And so at one point, I have Marion walking through this gallery, which doesn't exist anymore, and looking at portraits on the walls of boys and wondering what she's looking at.
Yeah. Your mention of the the great pirate text brings me to a question I'd like to ask Rebecca. You write about, so your book is Pirate Queens, about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and you talk about how they are anomalies because unlike so many women involved in piracy, they somehow escaped obscurity by being in the right place at the right time. Can you talk about what you mean by this, how they did that?
Sure. So I think in terms of the right place at the right time, so the two of them sailed as pirates only for about 2 months. And this is between August and October of 1720. And this is an extremely short amount of time to be a pirate. And what's very interesting is that there are very, very, very few documents about them that record them. This includes the trial, which is where the vast majority of information about Anne Bonny Mary Read come from, a proclamation of arrest by the governor of the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers, looking for Anne Bonny Mary Read and Captain Jack Rackham, who Anne Bonny was partnered with. And then occasional documents, occasional newspaper documents here and there, and occasional documents from the calendar state papers, but that's pretty much it. And yet, A General History of the Pirates was published just 4 years later in 1724. So it's getting compiled not long after this.
Yeah.
And they use Anne Bonny Mary Read as a marketing tool. It's on the cover page, featuring the female pirates. Mary Read and Anne Bonny is what it says. So this is one of the things that kind of really builds up their popularity. And this kind of continues to be a selling point for General History of the Pirate, even when the second volume comes out. So, and if you buy I've got a copy right next to me, actually. It's bound together in this volume, and it's still, the original cover still has their names on it. Now, what's interesting about their biography in it, though, is that they're pretty much completely fiction, and it's very much kind of this fantastical story that has become so prevalent over the years that a lot of opinion has come to believe it to be true, that Mary Read had disguised herself as a man most of her life and had worked as a man in the army and then on merchant ships and pirate ships. And Anne Bonny had also kind of disguised herself as a man on ships, when in reality, according to the few documents that we have, the proclamation for arrest by Woodes Rogers does list the female pirates, so people knew who they both were before they went sailing. In the trial transcript, it was described that they only wore men's clothing during battle, but wore women's dress otherwise. So, but it's kind of sort of this book, General History of the Pirates, while it's a really interesting source, it has kind of reshaped a lot of the realities about these two characters. And so, in my opinion, I believe that the only reason why these two female pirates probably became extremely famous is because of a General History of the Pirates. I don't think otherwise they would have been quite as notorious as we think, which is surprising. During this time, how could two women have done this? And therefore, it should be a massive sensation. Newspapers like to publish sensation back then just as much as today, if not more. I don't think they had journalistic integrity standards that back then that we do today. So they make a great subject. Now, I don't have a definitive reason why they weren't featured nearly as much. My guess is that because it's a few reasons. One, maybe the fact that it's two women, they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to possibly corrupt women who may read some newspapers, even though a lot of women were discouraged from doing so. But I think also it's because they were women, and women just weren't seen as equal contributors to society. They weren't seen as valued in society during the 18th century. And they were sentenced to execution, but the execution sentences were never carried out. One, because Mary Read passed away in jail, and also because Anne Bonny, there's just no execution record for her. And about 95% of women who committed a crime and were sentenced to execution were never actually executed. They were usually transported. But we don't have records for that. So I think what it is that they both kind of faded into obscurity in reality. And so through that, a lot of mythology, especially during the 20th century, has really come to kind of build them up in this way. And this really got pushed forward in the 1970s with an article called Anne Bonny and Mary Read, They Killed Pricks, which is what suggested that the two of them may have had a same-sex relationship, that they were much more powerful and much larger leaders on the ship than we possibly think. So the information about them is just, it's so tricky to kind of really understand like how and why they're being portrayed the way they were. But I think they very much were kind of a victim of circumstance. I don't think they set out to be these proto-feminists of the type who were trying to dispel any notion or any realities of what women suffered. I think that Anne Bonny was with Jack Rackham. It was not uncommon for captains to bring wives onto ships. And a lot of times women did have a respected position because of that. And, Jack Rackham probably allowed Mary Read to come on board at some point. It is possible Mary Read had some pirate connections. There's a few scattered documents that put her in the right place at the right time. There's a petition of a group of women whose husbands in 1707 are going to be executed for piracy in Jamaica. And there's a petition to have them freed. And the name Mary Read is one of the signatures on it. So this could have put her into the Caribbean, and having a pirate husband, knowing the world, she easily could have made her way to the Bahamas. There's another document of a woman whose husband was a pirate and he had been killed, and she's trying to get compensation because they're falling into destitute. His name was John Reed, and she listed a child named Mary. So that could be another, and that was in the late 1680s. So that could have also worked. And then there's one more document in the late 1710s of a woman who was caught for thievery, on prison for thievery, named Mary Read, who was sentenced to transportation. So there are a lot of ways that Mary Read could have possibly shown up, but and the circumstances could have put her into piracy. But yeah, so again, long-winded answer, but...
Brittany, yeah, but it brings me to a point from Brittany's book where you talk about how depictions of Anne Bonny and Mary Read tell us more about changing understandings of sex and gender than anything in particular about those two figures. I just wanted to note that because I found that really interesting. I would like, I'm not sure about this after having read all your books. Are women pirates sort of extra deviant for defying gender roles, or do they get some leniency because they're women? We've mentioned that there are a few examples of women in piracy being brought to justice. So I'm just curious in your particular context, what you think about this. Do women get away with more? Do they get judged more harshly? And can we start with you, Brittany, in Somalian piracy?
Sure. So in the Somali context and also West African context, the women pirates actually embrace and are able to kind of capitalize on femininity. So there's a few reasons for that. So one in Somalia, you know, gathering goods and resources needed to actually carry out a piracy operation, whether it's food, water, petrol, etc. Like those are a woman's job. So if you had men going to the store to buy these mass quantities of food for, you know, keeping hostages on the ship, they're going to get flagged by the police. Like that's just not something men do. Pardon me. So women kind of do it, and they always buy for, you know, their large families and cook. So women were able to do that without being noticed. Also, as far as, you know, when these ships would be hijacked and brought to the Somali shore, they would have to keep the hostages sometimes up for 3-4 years, some of these ships. And men don't do the caretaking in that culture. So they're not going to be sitting there cooking. They're not going to be cleaning laundry, bathing, whatever needs to be done. So the women are in charge of that. So the women get brought on the ships to take care of those tasks because they're seen as women's tasks. So it actually worked for the women in Somalia to kind of really embrace the woman aspect.
Mhm.
And they weren't seen by police authority, one, because they weren't looking, but also it was made very clear to us when we were kind of doing our counter-piracy work there that the Somali government did not want their women to be viewed by the rest of the world as being criminals. So it was told that we, you know, leave women out of it. They're not pirates. If they are, we will deal with them in how we deal with in culture. And so there aren't many women in prisons in Somalia anyway. They are dealt with through more family means. So the family will take care of it somehow, or the clan will take care of it. But the criminal justice system, mostly in Somalia, is just for the men. So, you know, you put those two situations together. We don't want to see our women doing this. We don't want the world to know our women are doing this, and their families will take care of it. And so women kind of just have remained in the shadows of this whole piracy operation.
So I'm curious if that maps onto other uh, contexts as well. So can we talk about, Catherine, can we, how are women perceived? Are they brought to justice? And
Oh, it's an interesting question, like the degree of deviance, right? I mean, I think that that's kind of a fascinating question. And whether or not they can get away with more, or whether or not they are subject to greater disapproval. I mean, I think one slight misconception is that we have this imagination that the maritime world was an entirely masculine world. And that's true to some extent, but it's also not true because, as Rebecca mentioned, it was very common for ship captains to bring a wife along. You know, it was common for you would encounter women at every port that you went to. Prostitution was very common. You know, it's not that there wouldn't have been women on board ships during the golden age of sail. And so that's why I'm persuaded by Rebecca's point that, you know, people probably knew who Anne Bonny and Mary Read really were, and that it's just more practical to wear men's trousers when you're raiding than it is to wear a skirt, because a skirt can get very tangled up. You know, just like, and speaking to an earlier point as well, like whether or not you would encourage an enslaved person to join your crew or not would probably matter more if you were Blackbeard. It would matter to you more if that person had a particular skill set that you were looking for, or if they were worth more to you just as cargo. You know, I don't think that it had anything to do with any kind of high ideals. It had everything to do with pragmatism. That being said, I mean, I think that in the early modern period, especially, and I'm especially fascinated to hear Brittany's characterization of Somali pirates. I'm so enjoying Brittany's part of this presentation so much. You know, the early modern period was a time of very rigid gender roles, and any sort of stepping out of expected behavior to some pretty strict social and on occasion criminal strictures. You know, this is a time when you can actually be like tried as a scold or tried for railing, you know, tried for you can get the attention of your community in a very negative way by simply being too angry in too public a way.
I'm glad we don't do that anymore.
I know. Do we not though? I mean, I've been on social media. Have you?
I'm joking. Yes. Yes, I have.
Yeah. And so in answer to your question, I don't know that I'm answering your question in a very satisfying way,
You're
but
just being fascinating.
you know, one of my favorite details from the account of Anne Bonny and Mary Read is, which I is probably fictional because it's from a general history, but I love it so much and I can't let it go. And it's that reportedly Jack Rackham was all depressed that he was going to be hanged and that he was allowed to visit Anne Bonny in prison. Rebecca knows where this is going. And he was allowed to visit Anne Bonny in prison and he was reportedly feeling all sorry for himself. And she says she's sorry to see him feeling that way, but if he'd only fought like a man, he wouldn't have had to die like a dog. I really hope it's true. I hope it's true.
Me too.